Well, thanks for the introduction, Natalia. I know that we've already met, I mean, the class and everybody. And I'm going to be very quick on the presentation, and it's going to be gender intersectionality and the relation with nuclear weapons at a glance, because we're short on time. But I wanted for you to know what does gender intersectionality, feminism have to do with nuclear weapons and disarmament, but also with security and international policies. To be honest, my intention is for you to have more questions at the end of the presentation, this presentation, than answers. These type of perspectives help us to question the norms and the status quo and the power dynamics, which, when talking about nuclear affairs, are evident and undeniable. So I'm going to the presentation in three pivotal aspects that I think that you need to know. First, the importance of inclusion and representation in disarmament and non-proliferation discussions. Then, what's important to consider the differentiated impacts, not only between women and men, but also across, for example, victims. And the last but not least, the leadership opportunities through feminist foreign policy that I foresee, and particularly the regional approach that we need to consider, that you as young diplomats need to consider. Well, first of all, and before going to those three aspects, let's get out of our chest the obvious and so often uncomfortable link between nuclear weapons and toxic masculinity. I mean, for this, I always use to illustrate, because there's nothing more clear than that this infamous tweet of the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, regarding, well, his nuclear button being bigger than, my nuclear button is bigger than yours. And he was referring to the nuclear button of Kim Jong-un from North Korea. So if this doesn't exemplifies perfectly the relation between nuclear weapons and toxic masculinity, nothing that I could say or anyone would convince you otherwise. And for this, we're going to drop some reference on the chat about some academic reading material that if you're interested in, you might want to check. For me, there are three very, very important academics that you probably know if you are related to international relations, feminism aspects. First is Carol Cohn. I want to recommend this very brief article about nuclear language and how we learn to pat the bomb. She was talking about this, and this is also important, back in the 80s. This is something that feminists have put on the table since 30 years ago. It's not something that New Age feminism is talking about. So she explains the language construction around nuclear weapons and how is set to set up our minds in this very masculine, militarized techno-strategic language. Then we have Cynthia Enlow. I also recommend that book, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. She's around still talking about this kind of issues. You will, if you Google it, you will get a lot of recent podcasts of her talking about the relation between military affairs and masculinity. And then we have also Ray Atchison, which is a very prominent activist from ICANN. For that, I particularly recommend the TED Talk. It's about 6 or 7 minutes where she talks about how the nuclear states have managed to gaslight the rest of the world with this perception of them maintaining the world secure through nuclear weapons, which if we think the other way, for example, with the ban treaty, it's precisely the contrary, right? We actually know now, and we have known for a while, that nuclear weapons does not make us safer, but they're a high risk. Now, putting this in the perspective of the multilateral formal arena which you are used to, I wanted to present some figures on some of the forums that you have been checking during this week. And for this, I have another recommendation that I think that you need to check. Not only if you're interested in disarmament diplomacy, but for general knowledge. It's a report from UNIDIRS that was launched in 2019. I think it's still behind the curve. It's a very, very short report, but it's full with figures and facts and very, very interesting information. More and more agents are getting involved in these discussions, not focusing only gender parity, but why it's important of involving gender agents. I mean, granting representation is the base in which we should set up, but it's not the ultimate fact. So I wanted to look at these figures, for example. If we think of the NPT, which is a treaty that we have been reviewing during this week, the last review conference back in 2015, 19% of the delegations were headed by a woman only. I choose this figure in particular because now we're used to have, this parity request across forums and across meetings. So yes, let's have, for the summer school only, we have more than 50% of participants are women, right? But it's not only to fill the room with half of the seats by the other gender, right? It's also to think about the kind of participation that they are having. So on that report that I will be referring during this slide, you will see also that, well, it's very interesting, but not so much surprising, that the participation of women tends to decline as the importance of the position increases. So this is what we know, it's the glass roof, the techo de cristal, and it happens everywhere, but particularly if you want to check it in disarmament diplomacy, that's a report that you need to look at. It has figures for the United Nations firms in New York, in Vienna. It also has figures for regional groups, so you might want to check how's the region doing on this, Latin America and the Caribbean, and maybe discuss it later. And well, now another treaty that we have been checking, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapon, 15% of the delegations were headed by a woman, and 31% was the average proportion of women participating at the TPNW. Now, I personally think that the ban treaty, the TPNW, it's a feminist achievement, not precisely in terms of participation, but in the contributions that were added, and the participation of many women, and many women of the region that you know better than me, that were key to negotiate it, adopted, and now for its entry into force. Now, as I mentioned before, the gender inclusion in disarmament and non-proliferation has been there for more than 20 years, like in a formal way. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted the Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And this document was a milestone because it was the first time that one of the main bodies of the United Nations addressed the disproportionate impacts of armed conflict in women and girls. It also stressed the importance of women's equal and full participation as active agents in peace and security, and recognized their contribution to maintain it. Well, since then, the Security Council has adopted another 9 resolutions that had taken into consideration what I just mentioned, and had included also gender aspects, mostly pointing out the differentiated ways in which women and men are affected by arms conflict. And this kind of matters have been integrated in multilateral discussions within the UN framework and in other treaties and instruments, such as the ones that you can see. Now, I want you to pay attention because 20 years, 2 decades is not too much, right? I mean, you're very young, but 20 years ago, you already remember what you were doing. So besides the Security Council resolution, we had another resolution by the General Assembly of the United Nations on women disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. There was also an inclusion in the Convention on Cluster Munitions referring specifically to gender-sensitive assistance. The Maputo Action Plan of the Anti-Personal Mine Convention, it also stated this inclusive, age, appropriate, and gender-sensitive matter. Well, the arms treaty is also very important because it integrated in the text of the treaty these gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. It's Article 7. And well, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which states in its preamble and Article 6 reference to gender aspects. Now, as diplomats, you know that it might be a word to words or phrase, but that it's very, very important, and that has a lot of discussions behind. Now, coming back to the NPT, which you have been reviewing, the history and what means for the disarmament regime, the cornerstone, I wanted to present that, well, the NPT has been there for 50 years. The first time that a country put on the table something related with gender aspects was barely in this in this cycle. It was in 2017 at the first session of the preparatory committee. It was a working paper submitted by Ireland. And Ireland presented another working paper in 2018 at the second session of the preparatory committee. And these documents are also very easy to find in the 5 languages of the United Nations. But it's important to see how, despite the 3 pillars and all the discussions that have been around the NPT, early in 2017, a country said like, okay, maybe we want to discuss something about gender. And I think that it's also important to look at how was that evolution, because in 2019, at the 3rd session of this preparatory committee, there were at least 3 working papers, and were not only submitted by Ireland, but a group of countries. It's very interesting also to look at that composition. It was Australia, Canada, Ireland, Namibia, Sweden, and supported by UNITER. But this kind of shows how to put these kind of issues on the table will opens the door for others to actually try it as well. But before 2017, nothing had been discussed regarding gender at all at the NPT. Now, everything that I'm presenting here is just as a glance. Again, is for you to have material to discussions, but it's just some food for thought that you can take with you and start wondering why it's important. Now, this takes us to the last part of this presentation. And well, how does these gender approaches and what I just said can be implemented? The narrative in disarmament and arms control has been historically surrounded by deterrence and power, and how the nuclear armed states interact with the rest of the world by arguing that it's best to maintain the status quo, in which some are powerful and have the right to possess nuclear weapons than others. This was something that someone pointed out during a session. I mean, why the nuclear weapon states have that right? And well, for us nuclear disarmament advocates, it's common to hear that complete and irreversible disarmament is unrealistic and a waste of time. Well, this is something that's also often said about the recent pursuit of the establishment of feminist foreign national policies by some countries. You know that this is very recent. I'm also sure that you're aware of what has been happening with this. But in 2014, Sweden became the first country to establish a feminist foreign policy. For this, I have another recommendation. It's this documentary called The Feminister. which actually narrates all the history of Margot Wallström, the Swedish minister, since she took the office all the way through the Security Council until the end. And well, in 2017, Canada established a feminist international assistance policy. In 2019, France set an international strategy for gender equality. And in 2020, Mexico adopted a feminist foreign policy too. So we can argue about these initiatives, whether they are coherent with national policies or with domestic policies, but we're not going to do that in this session. Instead, I want you to look at these examples as tools. I mean, how they share common objectives, such as the aim for equal representation and the strengthening of women's rights, as a base to start considering these novel or different approaches to global politics, particularly regarding disarmament and arms control. And it is, in my perspective, particularly important for our region. Here in the pictures, you can see a lot of probably your colleagues that you have been working with or that you currently work with, because women participation in disarmament in Latin America and the Caribbean is very, very strong. I also think that it's a huge window of opportunity. If we think about it, Latin America and the Caribbean has this historical history of being champions in disarmament and non-proliferation. So what if we consider that, and we consider these approaches that are already implemented in the region, and we combine them? I'm of course thinking about Mexico with the feminist foreign policy, and now with the Security Council, now that it's at the Security Council. But I'm also thinking about, for example, Costa Rica, with the being as a non-militarized country, as some of you said before, with this different perspective of the armed forces. I'm also thinking about Argentina with the party wave that they have right now, or the Caribbean, for example, Jamaica, with this strong female leadership with her Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Camina. To finish, well, I know very well that diplomatic processes require time and in-depth discussions. I truly think that business as usual are not only impractical, but over. So these proposals and perspectives challenging the basis from which deterrence narratives have been constructed, well, already exist and are already being discussed in the multilateral arena. So I think that it's up to you to embrace it, to grab it, and to use it. And with that, I'm going to finish, but I want to open the floor for you to discuss and let us know what do you think about this. Thank you. I don't know how to stop sharing.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mariana, for this enriching presentation. I will now open the floor to our questions and answers session. And I see that Lisa, our internet OPANAL, has a question. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this very nice, insightful presentation, firstly. And then I was wondering how you believe that the status of like the disarmament and non-proliferation around the world could change if women would participate more in the higher hierarchy.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, I think that the presence of women, I mean, is strong, but I definitely think that this approach from women, and particularly from feminists, could make the change. I mean, regarding disarmament is a little bit what I was talking at the beginning. We're used to this narrative, which has been constructed during 50 years about the nuclear weapon states possessors and this right of them, owning nuclear weapons, and the right that they have to defend themselves and to secure the world. This is this term that Ray Atchison explains in that TED Talk that I recommended about gaslight, which in feminism we know well is for someone, in that case a man, telling you something until you believe it, even if it's not true. And that's, she makes this comparison with nuclear weapon states, just repeating to the world that for them to have nuclear weapons make us more secure. But if you think it, that's not that reality. The mere existence of nuclear weapons, it is a very, very high risk. So I think that definitely participation of women is necessary, but also not only the participation, as I was mentioning, to fill out the room with 50% of women or diverse agents, but with meaningful voice participation and a critique view regarding the discussions.
Thank you, Lisa, for your question, and Marta Mariana for your answer. Do you have any other questions so far? Oh, we have a question from our another internet OPANAL. Paulina, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Marta Mariana, for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question is, what else do you think could be done in order to increase women's participation in nuclear disarmament issues? And how could civil society get involved in order to make this happen?
Well, thank you, Paulina. Well, that's a very critical question, because to be honest, it's not to have women only in disarmament aspects. It's to have, equity in every aspect of our life, right? And for that to be achieved, there is a lot of different considerations that, for example, organizers need to have into account, but it depends also on the realities of the women. There is a lot of women that, depending on the country, cannot have access, for example, to education. So if they don't have access to education, how are they going to have access to disarmament multilateral firms in the United Nations, right? So that's why feminism in this case is intersectional and and goes through all these kind of issues. So the first thing is to achieve parity, to have this minimum floor of having the representation, but then it's also to consider the different realities that everybody has. And civil society is actually, I would say that the one that is putting this on the table. I mean, if we put it regarding nuclear arms disarmament, ICANN has been very, very important regarding this. They are the ones that have been pushing. You have well, the humanitarian perspective, but also women, and not only women, but diverse identities as part of the negotiations. So I think that it's a matter of looking at those channels that are already there.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so. If not, I will pass it over to you, Jean.
Thank you very much. And also thank you to Marta Mariana. I was really privileged to work with her during her fellowship here at the Middlebury Institute, the virtual fellowship, put it this way, and was genuinely impressed with not only her dedication to this, but her knowledge of it. She has made this an area of study and has inspired, in fact, others as well. And so if I could kind of open the little box for advertisement, especially since we still have also some of our students with us, CNS has a young woman in non-proliferation group. If you are interested in that, even as young diplomats, please contact one of my colleagues, Sarah Bidgood, that you met when she spoke about the NPT. But if not, you can contact me to see how you can get involved in these initiatives. But this is really, really important. This is, as Marta pointed out, not simply about a gender balance. It's far, far more important and bigger than that. We don't have a gender balance in meetings and so on. I'm really pleased, and I want to congratulate all the organizers, but also the participants, that we have 50% plus women in this group. But that's not where it's at. Only at. It's an important part, but it's not the only part of it. So, Marta, thank you so much for very briefly highlighting this, and I think this is an ongoing discussion that we're going to have for many years to come.